So in the last lecture, you learned that in this event handler, we don't have access to this. Why is that? Well, earlier in the last section, you learned that this in JavaScript behaves differently from other languages. So depending on how a function is called, this can reference different objects. If a function is called as part of a method in an object, this in that function would always return a reference to that object. However, if that function is called as a standalone function without an object reference, this by default returns a reference to the window object, but if the strict mode is enabled, this will return undefined. And that's the reason in this event handler, we don't have access to this. So what is the solution? Again, in the last section, I talked about the bind method. We use that method to solve this problem. Let me show you. So here in this class, we're going to add a constructor. This is a method that is called when an object of this type is created. So in the constructor at this point, we do have access to this. So let me show you. Here I'm going to do a console.log saying here we are in the constructor. Let's see what is the value of this. Save the changes. Back in the browser, we get this error that you have seen before. This is not allowed before super. So because we added a constructor in this child class, first we have to call the constructor of the parent class using the super keyword. So we call super, save the changes, back in the console. Now you can see in the constructor, we do have access to our counter object. So this is not undefined at this point. So this is a perfect opportunity to use the bind method. So let's remove this line and type this, that handle increment. So earlier you learned that functions in JavaScript are objects. So they have properties and methods. One of them is the bind method. And with this method, we can set the value of this. So I'm going to use this here. And this bind method will return a new instance of the handle increment function. And in that function, this is always referencing the current object. So no matter how that function is called, this is not going to change. It's always referencing the current counter object. So this method returns a new function. We can get that function and reset handle increment like this. So this, that handle increment, we set that to the function that is returned from the bind method. Okay, so save the changes. Now back in the console, when we click the increment button, we no longer see undefined here. So we have access to the current counter object. And with this, we'll be able to update the state property. So here's one solution to bind event handlers to this. But you might find this a little bit noisy because in every component, you have to add a constructor, you have to call the base constructor, and for every event handler, you have to write code like this. There is another way to solve this problem. This is currently experimental and it may break in the future. So let's see how that works. Instead of adding this constructor, we can convert this function into an arrow function. Once again, in the last section, I told you that arrow functions don't rebind this keyword. They inherit it. So we can set this to an arrow function and this will solve our problem. Save the changes, back to the browser. Let's call this button. We get our counter object, perfect. So you can see using an arrow function is cleaner and simpler than adding a custom constructor and rebinding every event handler manually. So going forward, I'm going to use this syntax, but if this feature is not available at the time of you watching this video, use the former approach to bind event handlers.